Okay, so welcome back to Lecture 1, Part 3 of State and Local Public Finance, Lecture 1. So we now have this next category of state and local government charges as a main source of revenue. So this is a category that refers to specific direct payments for goods and services that are provided by governments. And typically, what these are going to be your higher education, for example. So, for example, you guys coming to Portland State University to study. This is a state university, which means that the state government is providing this particular service, and thus the tuition and fees that you pay are then thus paid to the state government. There are also other types of state and local services that are directly provided by the government. So there may be state or local government-owned hospitals, for example. And if people are paying fees or service fees for hospital services, then those are also considered charges. Another example might also be state parks, county parks, that charge an admission fee. So for example, if you go to an Oregon State Park and you pay for parking to be in the state park, then that is also considered a charge as well. And then you have this miscellaneous category, which typically includes a lot of different, miscellaneous categories. So for example, sometimes when the government sells certain assets, for example. So for example, if they have a building or land that they are selling on the market and they get proceeds from that, then that's going to fall into this miscellaneous revenue category. Another kind is interest earnings. So if the government keeps their money in banks and earns some interest on, that would fall into this category. One thing that is going to be a larger component that goes into the miscellaneous category for the state of Oregon is going to be any net revenues from our lottery system. So our lottery sales, those are going to go into miscellaneous as well. Okay, so some more minor sources of state and local revenue might include government enterprises. So typically most state and local governments don't run huge amounts of government enterprises, but we have a few. So those typically include liquor stores in the state of Oregon, for example. So those are considered government enterprises. So any gross revenue that you might get from selling liquor, those are considered government enterprise revenues. Other things like public utilities, if you have smaller local and regional governments that run their own public utility that are non-investor owned, then those revenues also fall into this category. But in most larger cities in Oregon, for example, in Portland, we are serviced by Portland General or Pacific Power. Those are going to be investor-owned utilities, which are then not public utilities, although they are governed by the Public Utilities Commission. They are not considered to be part of this government enterprise. So one thing that you'll see recurring on a lot of these budget spreadsheets is this insurance trust revenue. And this is going to be a category where you have a lot of revenues coming in and a lot of expenditures going out as well. And the biggest source of this is public employee retirement funds. And this is going to be kind of a more specialized category because most of the revenue that comes in for this insurance trust revenue can only be paid out for very specific purposes. In other words, if there are retirement funds coming in from public employees, then that money can only go towards paying out retirement benefits for public employees. So this is not a part of the fund where you can take anything extra and spend it on education, for example. So it's very specific. There are also other smaller components of this insurance trust revenue that comes from funds that are used for workers' compensation funds, for occupational safety or unemployment insurance. So all of that money comes in and is in these trust funds where they're invested, and so there are going to be typically interest earnings or dividend earnings from these funds, and that is the bulk of this particular revenue source. So if I were giving this lecture in class, I would ask you guys, from your knowledge from reading the textbook and the other readings from week 1 and week 2, what do you think are what is the largest category of state revenue? And typically a good guess for this would be sales tax in most states. And in Oregon, on the other hand, it is going to come from mostly personal income taxes. So this is a general distribution of what those things look like. So for most states, typically they get 25% from sales tax, approximately 20% from personal and corporate income tax, and then federal grants accounts for about 30%. So federal grants are money that are what we called intergovernmental revenue. That typically gets excluded from most of the discussion because it is not a source of revenue that most state governments have very much control over. The states typically have more control over own source revenues, which are the taxes that it collects by itself. So those are your sales tax and income taxes and so on and so forth. So for most states, the biggest source of own state revenue would be sales tax. On the other hand, here in Oregon, it is going to be personal income tax. For local governments typically don't collect things like sales tax or income tax, although some municipalities or counties collect small amounts of sales tax in certain jurisdictions. But most of the time, local revenue really comes from property taxes. And then also a good chunk of local revenue comes from state grants, which are then intergovernmental revenue that comes in from the state level down to the local level. Okay. So let's take a look at some of the numbers that are here. So this is from the 2016 annual survey of state and local government finances, which was just released in October 2018. So these are updated every year, although a little bit delayed in terms of how fast they put everything together. So here in Oregon, if you looked at how Oregon state revenues are distributed, you'll see that the biggest chunk, or one of the bigger chunks, comes from intergovernmental revenue, 30%-ish. And then a lot of the state revenues come from taxes. That's that orange piece of the pie right here, 33%. And again, the largest chunk of that comes from personal income taxes here in the state of Oregon. And in other states, that biggest chunk will probably come from sales tax. On the state side, you'll see a small piece on here that is labeled 0.00% that you can't even see on here in this pie. So that chunk there is the utility revenue. And there is a very, very small amount, so it's rounded to 0.00%. It doesn't mean it's exactly zero. It's just so small that you can't really see it on this pie. Mostly because the state doesn't really run any utilities. So those electric or gas or water utilities that are publicly owned are mostly at a regional or local level. So the only ones that the state of Oregon runs are probably going to be from some transit services, but it is very, very minimal. And the rest is kind of follows the general pattern of what we see. And I broke out this light green chunk here of the pie, and that's your insurance trust revenue that we just talked about. So that 12.5% piece of the pie is essentially separated from the rest of your governmental revenues because it is a chunk that has a very specific purpose going in and coming out of the state budget source. So there are also going to be other types of revenue streams that are specific and dedicated, and you might be able to find some of these through the reading on our state's budget from the Legislative Revenue Office, or also from this annual survey of state and local government finances that you'll be delving into a lot more detail for your problem set. So this is just a general overview, but I think as you're looking through a lot of the more specific numbers online, you'll be able to learn more about different pieces that you might be a little bit more interested in. Okay, so let's take a look now at local revenues. So again, local revenues excludes anything that happens at the state level. So for local revenues, again, the largest chunk of local revenues comes from the money that is collected at the state level and then distributed down to local and regional governments. That accounts for 35%. And then we have a big chunk that are going to be your taxes. So that's the piece that is broken out here. That almost 35% piece of the pie for local revenues is going to come from property taxes. So that's the biggest chunk here. So this is kind of foreshadowing what we'll be spending a lot of time on, because at the state level, the largest revenue source comes from personal income taxes. So we'll be looking more specifically at what those personal income taxes look like, how they're structured. But on the local level, where a lot of your planning activity expenditures are going to come from, that's going to be at your local level, and it's going to come from a lot of your property taxes that you see on this local revenue chart. And that's going to be where we spend a good chunk of time in the next couple of weeks discussing how does that work, and how do the different intricacies of the Oregon system really contribute to our expectation of how much revenue can we generate from different ways that we structure it. And on here we still have our local charges, and for local charges and miscellaneous category, that 21.66% piece, that's going to come from school lunch sales. It's going to come from your ports, your airports, your Port of Portland, for example, is going to come from parks. It's also going to come from parking and hospitals and sewerage, and those are your charges and miscellaneous category. And then in the utility revenue category, that's going to be your water supply, electric, and gas supply on a more local level. Okay, so remember, when you're looking at these spreadsheets, there are different combinations of these revenues. So my previous slide showed just the state level revenues, and the slide shows just the local revenues. And then there's also going to be a column that combines both of those into a state local revenues. But I think for the purpose of this particular lecture, it makes sense to break these two things out so you can see what are the major differences between the state and local levels. So that concludes this particular segment, and next we are going to take a look at the spending side of things.